Today I want to talk to you about the housing crisis and why we have a housing crisis, because it seems to be a complete and total mystery to Mr Hammond, our Chancellor of the Exchequer, and he admitted as much in his budget speech in November. He didn't understand it. Well, I'm going to explain it. It's quite simple. First of all, we are the most crowded piece of real estate on the face of the planet, England, and if you let 300,000 people in every year, you're going to find there's not enough houses to go round. You don't need the brains of an archbishop to work one out, do you? We just overcrowded. The island is hopelessly overcrowded, and there are too many people chasing too few houses. Easy peasy. Everybody down the pub understands that. The second thing is, of course, not quite so easy perhaps to understand, quantitative easing. For the last 10 years, the government has printed money hand over fist, counterfeit you might call it, billions and billions and billions, and they've artificially suppressed interest rates to 0%. It's flooded the banks and financial markets with money. Loads and loads of money. What happens when you get loads and loads of money chasing too few assets? You get asset price inflation, and that's what we've seen. Massive asset price inflation. Houses are assets, our most important asset, you might argue, and they've actually shot up. So your children and your grandchildren can't afford a house now, but that's largely the fault of the central banks, of course, and the governments who invested them. This is a problem, central banks. When I was my first house, when I was 1972, I bought my first house. The market wasn't interfered with by politicians or central banks. I bought my first house. I was a young professional man, and that was fine. Got a mortgage, put down my 5% deposit or whatever it was, easy peasy. That's because the market was allowed to deal with it. Now, there's another thing you're probably not quite so familiar with, because I wasn't until a little while ago. And that's the demand for social housing. Now, what the government have done, they've insisted that every fifth or sixth house that is built has to be for social housing. And the social housing has to be sold cheap as chips to the local housing association. Well, all very noble, I'm sure, all very noble in theory. But the question is, would you buy a house for 250 or 300,000, take out a mortgage, if you weren't quite sure who your neighbour was going to be? You could be living next to social housing, a housing association house, where you might be getting a rehabilitating druggie or rehabilitating ex-con or a jihadist back from Syria being given a free house, so on and so forth. You're not going to do that, are you? You'd be mad, wouldn't you, to do that? You want a little bit more safety when you make these investments about who you might have as your neighbour. Now, the developers have tried to meet the government halfway and say, look, okay, we'll build the social housing 1 in 6 or 1 in 7 or whatever it is, cheap housing, no problem, but what we insist on doing is maintaining them ourselves and putting our own tenants in so that we can protect the people who pay quite a lot of money for their houses. But they won't do that. So we have this ridiculous problem where there's been a logjam, and the Chancellor said in November he doesn't understand why there have been 800,000 planning applications granted for houses and they haven't yet been built. Well, Chancellor, that's your reason. That's your reason. They won't build them because they can't sell them, because nobody wants a neighbour from hell or a potential neighbour from hell. So if you step back from that and let the market deal with it, there could be, in the next 18 months, there could be another 800,000 houses. You're the problem, Chancellor. You and your colleagues in government, you're the problem. It isn't a tsunami. It is not an act of God that we have a housing crisis. You have caused it. So get your finger out, step aside and let the market deal with it.